First of all, we would like to thank Professor Pettifor for this wonderful presentation on international financial system. However, we were also sent some additional documents before the surprise came in, the book. We were given documents on international financialization and central banks and their independence. And so let's begin by talking about the history of central bank independence itself, and these are the contents. As EPOG students, this assignment is being graded and we are supposed to critique Professor Pettifor's work, but you have to be a very crazy orthodox economist to do that, so we would keep this discussion as a discussion and less of a critique. So let's go towards the history of central bank independence. So these are the two Substack articles. Professor writes very well on Substack. You should definitely give a follow. Free endorsement. And then, so how did we get there? So let's Professor Pettifor starts with the trust deficit that we had with the financial system and now the emergence of central bank independence. But let's say that this trust among the central banks was somehow distorted a few decades ago, about a century ago, if I'm not mistaken. At the heart of what we're talking about, the central bank independence, is the rise of fascism and deteriorating democracies, lies the disaffection towards the central bankers, which is relatively new considering that how revered these central bank chiefs were before the 2008 global financial crisis. To explain that, Professor Pettifor gives a very good example of the Bank of International Settlements, which is the granddaddy of all the private banks and how it was founded, which was founded by the Wall Street bankers and the central bankers around the world. They came together in the 1930s and they formed this beautiful bank in this beautiful city called Basel in Switzerland. And their ultimate goal was to provide financial stability to global private capital markets without getting into politics. And this was till Hitler took over the Czech Republic. The Bank of England chair at that time, Montagu Norman, was closely connected to Hjalmar Schacht, the chief of Hitler's Reichsbank, and it coerced the central bank in Czechoslovakia by threats of violence to transfer the gold of $6 million that they held in the name of BIS at the Bank of England. So what are we talking about? The politics. And the justification that the BIS at that time gave was that they could not refuse the decision based on politics made by the governments that did not exercise legal powers on it. This was the response of Bank of International Settlements to the Czech central bankers at that time. Now, this led to a serious downfall of the trust on these central banks. And as a consequence, we have seen an evolution of central bank. By the way, this meme represents what the BIS was trying to do. Sorry, Donald Trump, you were not there. When Czechs contested for BIS looting their gold, he was just doing business. That's what we interpret. So, as a consequence, when Czech Republic saw this, when Bank of England saw, and people, the government of England saw this, that they were basically sponsoring the Hitler's government because one person who was not supposed to be political was so closely connected to their Reichsbank, they basically nationalized the Bank of England. And then there is this paper by Bank Underground. If you see, there was a series of nationalization of banks. And as more leftist and anti-capitalist governments started taking over, more Keynesian planned economies started getting up, we see a series of nationalization of central banks, and we can also call it the Trente Glorieuses, the glorious period of 30 years that we have. And the next slide. And however, everything was fine, like Professor mentioned, till Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan came in, and then came the IMF boys. The first product was Argentina. And look at this, despite having high rate of nationalized central banks, we also started giving a lot of leverage to central bankers what they could do with the financial system. And this was evident from the 1997 when the Labour government comes back into England. Then I think Tony Blair states that in one of his statements he mentioned that the role of central banks is to provide price stability and control inflation and financial stability. So before that, it was also the employment that was being monitored by central bankers, but now the employment scenario, the reaching full employment, higher and steady level of employment was completely missing, and that's what we call the divorce of the duality of mandate of central banks began, and that's where the world headed after the 97, and over to Anna.
There is one slide before, I think. Yes. So since the 80s, the neoliberalism, since the neoliberalism reform, we can see that CBI's, the central bank's independence, has been increasing over the time and accumulating. Only after some crisis, there is some reforms that this cannot happen. And the main policies has been privileged inflation regulation, monetary and financial stability, what has been weakens government stability, ability to engage in redistribution, what increase inequality, and also reduce labor bargain and favored capital markets. These all three consequences generate social and political eruptions due to the high levels of economic insecurity that these kind of policies bring, and this is as a consequence of this kind of policies is the rise of the right-wing populism, also along with the out of proposal from the progressist camp. So there is this rising of populist leaders such as Trump in the US and Milei in Argentina. These populist leaders, they got the diagnosis right. People are suffering without housing or like high inflations in Argentina, but they are suggesting the wrong solutions. For example, in the case of Argentina, the abolition of the central banks, and that would make them more vulnerable to instability within the country. And these kind of policies also move forward from democracy in the central banks than before. Yeah.
So now we extend the discussion towards the global south of this whole financial instability and central bank independence. So Professor Pettifor makes a very good remark about Argentina and other countries that are trying to incorporate crypto and dollarization to get rid of their central banks, is because there has been a distrust among the central bankers. And why is there a distrust? Well, you look at this chart. So I created this chart for another thing. Who needs a central bank chief? Sorry. Professor Pettifor made a point that Argentina is dollarizing itself. So what it will do is that it will give the monetary authority power from the hands of the Bank of Argentina to the Bank of the US Federal Reserve. And there are fears that the US Federal Reserve would control or just completely destroy the monetary policy of Argentina. Well, you do not need US Fed to destroy your economy when you have the central bank of your own. Look at the central bank chiefs in your own country. Where are they coming from? In India, we've had great economists from Chicago School of Thought, from London School of Economics, trying to control a lot of things, high rate of interest. But look at their policy. If you look at the, so this chart basically represents the trend of controlling inflation in developing countries which are facing deterioration in their democracy index scores by VDEM. We have rich oil and petroleum exporting countries, which are all dictatorships, and excluding Venezuela because it was an outlier, and you have emerging markets. So you see this chart that everybody's trying to cope up with what the US is trying to do. So whenever the US decides some policy, the developing countries, the authoritarian countries, they don't think of their own. They think that if the US is doing something, let's follow that. And that's because the IMF, the World Bank, all these international agencies have deployed their sepoys in the central banks of developing countries, and that's why we're looking at. The other example was of the convergence. So what happens when the school of thought of your central bank is governed by an institution which has nothing to do with your economy? Then you have something similar. There's another convergence. So look at this. So this red dot represents the OPEC countries. This is emerging markets with deteriorating democracies, and this is the US. So this chart basically tells you that the government general expenditure as a percentage of GDP remained almost flat till 2019 in both emerging markets and the US. And when the US started spending money because of the COVID-19 pandemic, emerging markets also started doing the same, and then it started coming down. So that means the central bankers of developing countries are trying their level best to look like good boys in front of the IMF and the US Federal Reserve. So that was my disagreement, that you do not need US Fed to destroy your economy. You have your own central banks to do the same. And sorry, and as a consequence, there is a great rift between the central banking authority and the fiscal authority in the country. This basically tells you the attrition rate, the number of central bank chiefs in the last 10 years. Venezuela has had 7, Algeria had 6, Libya had only 1, but because in Libya they appoint some government official who is loyal to the government, so they never have the independence. But in emerging markets, we have some mixed results. Like in hybrid regimes, we have some sort of stability, but otherwise, in authoritarian regimes, it's really hard to be a central bank chief, because if the government doesn't agree, or if this monetary policy doesn't agree, the government always has the power to fire them thanks to the nationalization.
Yeah, building on that, we also have to consider the structural inequalities within the international financial system, and have in mind that there is international financial subordination that affect more developing and emerging economies. We can't access truly democratic central banks without also tackling key structural issues such as currency hierarchy, where these developing countries rely mostly on US dollars, limiting their monetary autonomy. And also we can have a look at how much it costs for developing country borrowing money. So there is a high currency hierarchy. Debt dependence is another challenge, as many countries are trapped in cycles of borrowing and repayment, leaving them vulnerable to external shocks. As we can see on the chart below, the interest rate and payments for developing countries also rising, and for developers going down. And not to mention also trade disparities that developing economy is always exporting low-value goods and importing high-value products, deepening even more trade inequalities. And finally, capital flights that in moments of crisis goes out of developing countries. All these disparities should be taken into account to reformulate and democratize also the monetary international system, and not only the central bank. And some initiatives to democratize international financial organization has been already proposed. For example, increase representation diversity in the staff of IMF or in the World Bank has been increased over the time, but is still not sufficient. Changing the vote distribution, the IMF, as we can see, it's really a disparity comparing all the economies. The US has favored much more voting power inside the IMF decisions than other countries. And also another options, it will be establishing that belief without mechanism, without conditionalities. Yes, thank you.
So this leads us to the second theme of our discussion, which is that we want to also introduce some cultural explanations to the politics of money, what Professor Pettifor's argument about the neoliberal economic governance was mainly class. So this really, this system of governance that we have favors Wall Street, the interests of the capitalist class, and then also see the right-wing populism as a bit of a reaction to the former, by an impoverished working class, but whose aims are ultimately misguided, because they, in the end, the right-wing populists would probably make their economic insecurity even worse. And what I don't want to do here is invalidate the relevance of class-based analysis, but bring in also some more nuances from a more cultural perspective to explain neoliberal economic governance, and specifically the neoliberal thinking about money. So what you talked about with money as a commodity that is scarce, that is a thing, and so on. And I think we have like some good work by some more intellectual historians that talk about, for example, what the early neoliberal thinkers like Hayek, but also now a lot of these right-wing populists like Trump or Elon Musk would think about money and finance. And I think if we can summarize it in one sentence, it is the belief that the hierarchies and inequalities that we see are somewhat natural and not socially constructed. And this belief needs then what Quinn Slobodian, who is a historian, called the three hearts. So we need a hardwired human nature. So stuff like gender or race are hard. For example, we need hard borders, but we also need a hard money according to them. And this would mean something like a precious metal, like gold, or also something like the Bitcoin as also a scarce medium. And they don't want to accept money as a social medium that we can control and shape. And I think this thinking also unites really the neoliberal, the early neoliberals, and also the current right populists, because at the birth of neoliberalism, when also the gold standard was replaced by a fiat money system. There's this quote by Paul Volcker, one of the central bankers during the time, that a determined central banker could act like a surrogate for gold. So the central bank independence that Nikhil was talking about with the history can be maybe seen as a surrogate for the gold standard, because we want to keep money scarce, or like not we, but like the right-wing populists want to keep money scarce. And what I also found very interesting when doing this research is that there was always this link between monetary discipline, but also cultural discipline. So this is a quote by James Buchanan, who is one of the early neoliberal economists, and he also won the fake Nobel Prize. And so what he sees in this like golden period of Keynesianism with the there was a lack of monetary discipline that led to inflation, but he saw that also connected to other events in the cultural sphere, like a erosion in public and private manners, liberalized attitudes towards sexual activities, declining vitality of the work ethics. So this is when you let the Keynesians into your central bank. This is what happens according to him. So I think by bringing culture into this picture, we can maybe explain the right-wing populism even a bit better. We see that they vote against their economic interests, but maybe because they want to defend their cultural identity, which is really based on this like naturalized hierarchy around gender and race. And if we accept money as a social construct, what else is a social construct? And then that's how the argument goes. And then also maybe there's more continuity than a break between the neoliberalism and the right-wing populism, as they share some cultural beliefs and this ideology of hard money. Thank you. This was our discussion, and we prepared some questions which we're also going to read out loud.
So my question to Professor Pettifor would be, how much autonomy are we willing to give the monetary policy authorities, especially in developing countries, who, despite being nationalized in the nationalized banking system, work in the favor of the rent-seeking class, here the interest-bearing capital owners?
Yeah, and my question would be, considering all the structural differences, to what extent could a more democratic central bank address disparities within the international monetary system? And would a democratic central bank in the global south function similarly to those in the global north?
And my question would be, is class the most useful category to understand both neoliberal central bank independence and right-wing populist resurgence? And does right-wing populism constitute a rupture or a continuity with neoliberalism? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we can have a first round of responses, and then we will open to the other students. Thank you.
So, I mean, that was so impressive, and I'm also grateful for some of the insights. And please, can I have a copy of your presentation? Because I certainly want that Paul Volcker quote. I'm going to use it a lot. So I think you can be very critical of my position in relation to independence of central bankers, because you're right. There are plenty of central bankers who are part of nationalized banks who behave just like the bad ones do. So for me, and I think that's what you should, and I've worked in Africa. I worked on debt cancellation for some of the poorest countries, and I worked for a long time in Nigeria, and I helped Nigeria clear $30 billion of debt. So I know quite a lot about Nigeria. I would never allow the government of Nigeria to have access to the funds in the central bank, because the central bank holds on to all the nation's hard currency. So when you make a purchase in dollars and you live in Nigeria, the dollars have to come to you through the central bank. Of course, there's plenty of ways of evading it, but the central bank is where there is a hoard of hard currency. Nobody wants Nigerian naira, everybody wants US dollars. And Nigerians who want to buy a house in North London need those dollars in order to pay for the house. And so we see in Nigeria that politicians are involved in the central bank, and that's very bad news, right? So that, I think, is the major criticism that you rightly are to make about this question of independence of central bankers. But the key point is this: you know, the independence idea is part of the broader ideology. It's part of how do we get the market to decide everything. And we do it by having this pretense of independent central bankers. So what we really have to do is change the ideology. That's the big story, you know. And for me, the big story is that, can we afford to finance the green transition? And my answer is, can we afford not to? We're going to die. We're all going to just lie down and die if we don't do something about making that transition sustainable, both for ourselves, but also for future generations. But that takes money. And that's the beauty of the way in which we evolved a monetary system. In the old days, very 5,000, 6,000 years ago, if I wanted to trade with you, I had a chicken and you had, I don't know, you had rabbits. I would have to swap my chicken for your rabbits, right? But when we evolved a system of promises to pay, you could say, look, I'd like 3 of your rabbits, and in exchange, I'm a hairdresser. I will cut your hair in next month when you need your hair cutting, right? So I'm promising to pay you for your rabbits, but not straight away. I'm promising you to pay you later. And in the village where there was this credit system operating, there would have been a chief or a priest, the high priest, and he would have said, hey, I see you're promising to pay Mrs. Jones for her 3 rabbits. Now I'm watching you. Next month you better cut her hair, right? And if you don't honor your obligation to Mrs. Jones, you know, you're going to be disgraced in the community or whatever. So we evolved these systems to enable us to do what we can do. That's why the monetary system is a great public good. That's why it is a brilliant institution, a brilliant system. It enables us to do what we can do, as Keynes famously said. But the problem is it's been captured. It's now used entirely, almost entirely for the use of the 1%. It's controlled by them in their interests. This is the casino theme. This is Wall Street. Wall Street now has got control of it. Not my government, not your government, not even the US government has control over what's going on in Wall Street, right? And that's harmful to society. So if society wants to rebuild the whole of Los Angeles, our monetary system enables that to happen. But when BlackRock comes along and says, I will help you rebuild Los Angeles, but that will be by lending you money, and I will charge you 8%, 9%, 10% on your investment in restoring Los Angeles. And the problem with interest rates of 8 or 10% means I have to exploit and work even harder to repay more than what I've even borrowed. That 8% per year per annum, over a period of time, which requires greater extraction of the ecosystem's finite assets. I'm going to have to dig deeper, I'm going to have to exploit more land, I'm going to have to pour more concrete in order to earn the money to repay BlackRock this very expensive rate that it will lend to me at. And I'm very risky because I'm a homeowner in Los Angeles and I have no collateral, right? So they can charge me what they like, right? Whereas if the state intervened in rebuilding, if we used the central bank's resources to rebuild, if the government was able to do that, then the government could do it at very low rates of interest, and that's what they should do. Interest can be usurious. It's a kind of, in all the religious faiths, usury is a sin. It's a sin to earn money effortlessly without doing anything just because you're lending it, right? Because you can, because you've got the power, because you own the surplus, right? And we allow that sin of usury to prevail. So I'm rambling here, but in answer to your excellent presentations, what I'm trying to say is that you're right, that you can't expect that much from central bankers, even in nationalized banks, even if the government does intervene. And anyway, I do also believe that there ought to be a little bit of distance. It's as if, I needed a loan from a commercial bank, and I arranged for myself to be on the board of that commercial bank. What am I going to do? I'm going to make sure I get that money cheap and I get it quick and I get much of it, right? That doesn't quite work. And the great thing about the relationship between the central bank and the state is that the state is backed by taxpayers. So every state, and especially in the OECD countries, has good taxation institutions, collects taxes, right? And that makes the state like Britain a really powerful institution. Every month, every day, every year, income is coming from the population into the treasury, right? There's no corporation which can generate that much revenue that regularly and that safely and legally enforce that payment. No private corporation can do that. That's the power of the state, right? So what the state can do with that, you can say, look, I've got all this collateral. It's called tax revenues. I've got a population of 30 million that pay taxes. That is my collateral. Can the central banks please give me the liquidity, the cash that I need to rebuild Los Angeles, right? And at a very low rate of interest because I'm a sound borrower, right? So this is how the system should work. There should be a relationship between the fact that the collateral that the state enjoys as a result of taxation is enough for it to be able to borrow from the central bank. And there should be just a kind of balance between that. And it's a delicate one. Keynes was very clear about it's a fudge. You fudge that relationship, really. But that relationship only works when the economics underpinning it work. So that's my answer to your criticism. I like very much the cultural point as well. And I hadn't really given enough thought to that. I would like to give it much thought, and I think you're right. It's about conservation of my cultural values. It's about how my values are associated with that hierarchy of money and how, this whole hierarchy of men at the top and women and children at the bottom. This is something fundamental to me culturally. And that's then reflected in my economics. So I think that's fascinating, and I would like to do more on that. I just would like to thank you primarily for taking the very little bits and pieces that I sent you as a basis for this. But I would encourage you to increase the criticism of central banks that are too closely tied to the state. There is a problem with that as well. So I think, shall we stop at that point? I mean, presumably other people have questions as well.
So let's start with the questions.
I have a question of understanding, because I think you said that the state, that when they borrow money, it's an asset. An obligation from the state is an asset, but it's not material. So I don't understand really. And I have also a question. You say that there shall be like a good economic, means that the states can, you said the state is backed by taxpayers, and taxpayer can pay tax because the economy is working fine. But how can you guarantee that the economy will work fine enough to pay all this? And then another last question is, if there is more obligation from state, there is more gambling, because you said that those kind of asset obligation from state, they produce gambling. So you want to put some more for transition, and so you may have more gambling. So I think that there is also a problem.
You prefer responding now or collecting now?
Can we do that? What's your name? Sylvain. So the question is this: if you think of collateral, so if you think of Airbnb, right? You own a flat in Paris, and you put it on Airbnb, you're going to get rent every time it's lent out, right? If you're clever, you can rent it out all year, right? So that flat is generating income for you, that asset, okay? In the case of the state is taxing people in work and people that spend money when they go shopping, right? The state has got 30 million taxpayers, registered British citizens, for example, right? That means that when you buy a bond or when you take a bond from the British government promises to pay back in 30 years. And we know that for the last 150 years, the British government has never defaulted on its debt. That's why this is a very special asset, a government bond, right? Because the British government forces its taxpayers by law to pay their taxes. If you don't pay your taxes, unless you're Amazon or whatever, you could go to jail, right? That's the legal structure. So what that asset, that bond has got is guaranteed income. Your Airbnb flat doesn't have such guarantees. You may not be able to rent it out. But if you're the state, you can collect those taxes, right? So that's why Wall Street likes that asset, because more than any other asset in the world, it's safe. You know the British government's going to pay.
But in practice, the debt of the state keeps increasing, so they just borrow more and more and more money. So
Yeah.
So it seems that maybe it won't work.
Well, so let me give you the example of the British government in 1945. They had spent a lot of money going to war. So the debt was 250% of GDP, right? And they had taken that money and they'd blown it up. It was rubbish money because all that it did was to destroy people and land and countries and so on. But that's war. War is destructive. 250% of GDP, at that moment they begin to spend money. They build houses, they build the National Health Service, they build an education service, they nationalize the coal industry, and what happens? Money starts coming into the bank. Money starts coming into the treasury. The debt falls as relative to income, and within 5 years, 10 years, Britain was back to the same state she'd been when the economy was prospering. So the state has the capacity to build up large quantities, and the debt arises. The debt arises because if you have unemployment, if you have a weak economy, if your economy is failing, you can't collect tax revenues, right? So the answer is for the government to stimulate the economy to make sure that it does generate tax revenues. When tax revenues are low, it's because unemployment is high. It's common sense, right? If you are unemployed, you can't pay taxes. But if you make that person employed, they begin to pay taxes. You got me? So how do you make sure the private sector is not going to increase employment, but the state can increase employment? The state can take the risk of spending because it knows that it's going to benefit from tax revenues. So yes, you know, your point about they're using that debt for gambling, I think I agree with you. I think that it's the way the system has evolved is that, you know, they are like parasites on the state, Wall Street. They're using those assets to leverage additional finance for themselves. And the state says, yeah, we're very happy for you to do that. And by the way, you can fix the yield on that bond as well. And that's kind of crazy, really. It's crazy economics, but that's the way the system has been allowed to evolve to suit Wall Street. So that's just in part my answer to your questions. Okay?
Thank you. Hi, I'm Charlie from the UK. Maybe before I ask my question, I'll sort of like nail my colours to the wall. I always feel, just for a lack of democracy, like quite uncomfortable with the idea of central bank independence. I remember reading, I think in the Financial Times, but I might be wrong, a few years after the 2019 general election, that both the Bank of England and the British Civil Service were preparing, prior to that election, for how they could constrain the economic programme of a potentially incoming Labour government in 2019. Obviously a programme that you know very well. Of course, this wouldn't even necessarily be something that would be constrained to the left. This might all happen to future governments on the right as well. How concerned would you be that if the British people or electorate of any country decided to elect a government that didn't fit the ideological outlook of unelected officials in the Bank of England or the British Civil Service, how concerned would you be that there is like quite a clear democratic deficit here? And sort of, as a follow-up to this, why should monetary policy be out of the hands of democracy and not also make an argument for putting defence policy in the hands of generals, putting fiscal policy in the hands of other officials, etc., etc.?
So I was part of that government, or was that Corbyn's team? So you're absolutely right, but that's my point. My point is that the Treasury and the Bank of England have acquired a sort of status beyond the state, an independence, and they feel entitled to undermine democratic decision-making. My point is that the system is not democratized, that money is democratic. It's a democratic thing or an undemocratic thing, basically. There's a wonderful book by Stefan Eich called Politics of Currency, or the Currency of Politics, I'm never sure which. And can I please encourage you to read it? It's a really excellent book. But the point is that these guys are just fulfilling the current neoliberal ideology. That's what they're doing. And they have enough power. So we have a crisis right now in London where interest rates on government debt are going through the roof, and Rachel Reeves has been attacked by all sides on the right, I don't agree with all of her. I think she made big mistakes in her budget, but the fact of the matter is she is elected. She is democratically accountable. The Bank of England governor doesn't go and stand on the street and ask to be voted for. Nobody ever, people hardly know who he is, right? So right now they're saying, sorry, but you have to cut public spending. We demand you cut public spending, or else we're going to tell the market to increase the yields on government debt, right? And that's what, now the Bank of England has the power to bring down those yields. What's happening at the moment is the governor of the Bank of England is engaged in a process called quantitative tightening, right? He's disposing of the bonds that he has on his balance sheet, which means there's fewer, and that's putting up the price of the yields on bonds. It's complicated, but it's a direct result of a highly political governor of the Bank of England at the moment increasing yields on government debt and holding the elected representative of the country to account and trying to destroy her, basically. This is a very blatant political action that's going on right now. And the demand is cut public spending, and stop doing all that stuff you're doing about workers' power and so on, or else we will just bankrupt the Bank of England, bankrupt the Treasury. So it's warfare, it's class warfare, right? It looks terribly well behaved, it looks very professional, it looks very, you know, these guys don't walk around with criminals written across the front of their T-shirts, but they are, essentially. So this is my problem, but the problem is the way in which we've allowed the economy to become detached from democratic accountability. We've been persuaded that we have to marketize everything. We have to marketize money. And, you know, I'm quite happy with the market in sugar, but you can't have a market in money. It's just not possible, really. And they've forced it on us. And they've done that because it enables them to detach the business of finance from the state, the democratic state. So this is not an accident. This has been designed to happen in this way. But we all go along with it, you know. You think that it's good to have a central bank that's independent. We think it's good to have sound money. We think, oh, public debt is evil. We all agree. And we help this ideology to be sustained. So that's our problem. And I want to see, I grew up in South Africa under a nationalist regime where there was no democracy, where the people weren't allowed to vote. I'm passionate about the rights of people to democratic institutions. But, you know, the way the system is now, and you know, for me, it comes back to money as commodity. That enables them to think about money and markets. And markets can become detached from the state. And that way you can undermine democracy. So, you know, we can fiddle with the Bank of England, the governor, we can sack him, but we won't change the ideology. It's the ideology we have to change. And you guys have to do that because you're the generation that's going to make that difference. Phew, this is exhausting, Bruno.
Can we have more questions? Or
Are there questions?
Thanks for the presentation. I'm Sarah from Germany, and I would like to come back to the point you just raised about the relationship between democracy and the monetary system, because I'm very much sympathetic to the proposition to put the monetary system into more democratic hands. At the same time, there's all these talks about the crisis of democracy. There's a crisis in terms of people not thinking that democratic outcomes are legitimate. There's a crisis of people not feeling represented by the democratic systems that are in place. There's, of course, the rise of right-wing populism around large parts of the globe. And yeah, many people are not participating properly in those democratic systems. So given all these flaws in democratic systems that we see today, I'm wondering what exactly is the potential to democratize the monetary system? Can it perhaps fix parts of this democratic deficit, or do we just import the flaws of the democratic system into the monetary system? If we, yeah, I don't know. Do you have any ideas on how that could look like?
So my explanation social democracy in Europe has been totally discredited. Why? Because social democracy went along with the marketization of the financial system, right? We supported it. I mean, in Britain, it was Tony Blair. Tony Blair left number 10 Downing Street and went straight to Wall Street, right? And that's true for social democracy across Europe. Social democracy in Europe has collapsed. And that's because what the people found was that actually, what's the difference between you guys and the conservatives? What is the difference? You are also upholding a system which denies me democratic rights, which denies me a decent income. My income has been falling, and Germany is classic, since the Hartz reforms introduced by a social democratic party, clobbered incomes, while the 1% got richer and richer and richer. And so German people are saying, why do I have to pay the price for all of this? And you, social democracy, have done that. Not the AfD, they didn't do that to me. Social democrats did that to me. And for me, that's the tragedy of social democracy. I mean, it doesn't exist in France. It's collapsing in Germany. It's horrifying to see the polling numbers in Germany. It's collapsing in Britain. We had the very lowest share of the vote, this Labour government, in a very long time. So it's the collusion between politicians and this right-wing project, this right-wing neoliberal project, and in a sense, what's so awful about it is that it's a direct replica of what happened in the 1930s. We had exactly the same thing. In the 1930s, we had the gold standard. We had markets detached from the state and from democracy, and people became disillusioned. They were losing their jobs. They couldn't find a roof over their heads. Their kids couldn't go to university or school, right? So they said, look, we're tired of the market telling us that we can't afford a home, that we can't afford to go to university, that we can't afford a decent income. So if you want to do something about the markets, then I'm going to go to that strong man who promises to protect me from markets. That man was Hitler. Today it's Donald Trump. I will build a wall, he says. I'll protect you from those markets. I will protect you from China. I'm going to protect you from you that live in the Rust Belt. I'm going to protect you because the Social Democrats couldn't protect you from that. Do you see what I'm saying? And it's exactly what happened in the 1930s. So what do? We get fascism in the 1930s and a catastrophic world war, and then we wake up and think, oh, damn, you know, the system was really wrong. Let's change the system. I'm just hoping that we don't get fascism again and another catastrophic world war before we wake up and think about changing the system. I'm here because I want you guys to go out and fight for that new system, to tackle fascists and say, no, that's not the answer to the question. The answer to why Germans have got low incomes is to do with the way in which the power structures are arranged around the finance sector. We've got to change that, right? That's what you guys have got to do. It's your obligation. I know it's a hell of a legacy for us to leave for you, but that's what you guys have to do. You have to change the system. I'm not going to lie down here and say we've got to have fascism and another catastrophic world war before we can change the system. I believe that intelligence and understanding and moral courage can change the system. But that's what you guys have to do. She just giving them a big responsibility. Right.
Hi, Professor Pettifor. I'm Nikhil RAMPAL from India. So my question to you is from a developing country's perspective. So like you also mentioned that when it comes to bailing out failing private banks, when it comes out to bailing out big billionaires and their money and all these investment banks, the central banks never blink an eye. Wall Street would definitely give them money. But when it comes to failing people, like for example, COVID-19 was the biggest tragedy of our lives, like for at least for the millennials. And the central bank always say no towards fiscal spending on keeping the population afloat. So what's this choice and what's this tussle between the fiscal and the monetary policy that what's the rationale that they choose between these two decisions? And the other one was that in the US, this is related to this one. So in the US, inflation happened despite the fiscal stimulus. In India, same trajectory of inflation, even more than that, without a fiscal stimulus. So can we agree, or can we agree to disagree that COVID-19 was just a supply side disruption for inflation and not the demand side? I would like to know your take on this.
So the post-COVID inflation, it can't be blamed on fiscal policy. I blame it on financial speculation in commodity markets. You know, the energy market and the grain market went berserk. And by that, the speculative aspect of it. So in my book, I've got a chapter on the global financial system and commodities. So back in 2000, Bill Clinton, to the help of the governor of the central bank and prominent economists like Larry Summers, changed the law which regulated speculation in commodity markets. In the past, you know, there were limits to the amount of money you could throw at commodities. As soon as Putin began behaving badly, the markets went into full-scale speculative mode, right? And they pushed up the price of gas and oil. And gas fixes the price for all other energy supplies across Europe, right? And that was done partly as a result of supply and demand. Putin was restricting supply of oil, and that would cause the price to raise. But then on top of that, speculation caused it to rise even further, right? So the inflation isn't the global inflation that followed on from COVID and from the invasion of the Ukraine was caused by, in my view, largely commodity markets, not by fiscal policy. So that's number one. And number two, yeah, you know, that's the problem, because central banks don't believe they're there to serve the public. And you know, the public are not stupid. When they decide to join populist parties and to back authoritarian leaders, they're doing it with common sense. They need protection because those markets are killing them. The market, you know, the cost of living crisis is killing people. It literally is. People can't afford health in the United States. They can't afford food in Britain. We have food banks, which we've never had on a scale. They can't afford their children to go to university. They can't afford to rent a place to live in London, right? They're mad as hell. They are going to vote for a party that says, we're going to do something about those markets. We're going to protect you from those markets. And that's not stupid. That's perfectly sensible. They need protection. And if politicians won't give them that, if social democrats won't give them that protection, then the authoritarians will. And the authoritarians are arguing that that's what they're going to do. They're going to protect people. Trump is very clear. I'm here to make America great again. I'm here to look after you small guys. Never mind that I'm helping my mates here on Wall Street. You know, that's by the by. Do you know what I mean? So the popular appeal is rational. And if we on the left are arrogant about it and we say, oh, these people are stupid because they're voting for fascists, we just don't get it, right? You've got to get it. You've got to understand that people have got a real reason to look for strong men in politics. And we've got to take that away. We've got to give them greater security. We've got to give them a sense that their incomes will rise, that their children can go to university, that they can find somewhere to live. And we don't do that at the moment. Right, I'm going to have to catch a train soon. So.
Okay. Can you have a very final question or not?
Okay,
we had one there. Okay. Okay.
Hello, thank you very much for coming. My name's Matilda, I'm from Germany. I wanted to ask a slightly less economics question and more political question, which is that you've also been involved a lot with campaigning and in the public. And I wanted to ask you, basically from a strategy question. In calling for democratizing the financial and monetary system, what would you say are some important takeaways you've had from doing this for a lot of your life, both in terms of how we should frame the issue of what we're fighting for and how we can build alliances?
Debts for the low-income countries back in the early 90s, before some of you were born, I think. And when we started, when I took on the role of, I had a leadership role to play, I was asked, how are you going to explain this to the public, to the British public? Because what you're asking is to cancel the debts of the poor countries. And I said, yeah, it's going to be very difficult. We've got to decide how we frame it, and we reframed it. So we'd go out and we'd say, look, we must cancel the debts of these poor countries, Africa, you know, Mozambique, Malawi, and so on. And people would say, why cancel their debts and not mine? I've got a mortgage, I pay my mortgage, why shouldn't they pay their debt? And anyway, those black people, you can't trust them, they're all corrupt, and they're all cheating, and they're incompetent. So why should we cancel their debts, right? And then we began to think about how we framed the argument. We said, well, actually, if you think about it, why did your government use public subsidies to lend money to African dictators so that they could buy weapons from Britain to attack their people, which is what we did, for example, for Nigeria? And they said, what do you mean taxpayers' subsidies for loans to Nigeria? Well, I said, let's introduce you to the government's credit guarantee department. The government has a department where if you export into countries, the government, the taxpayer, guarantees you against losses. The Export Credit Guarantee Department is called. Every country has it. The United States has a huge export credit guarantee country. So does Japan. So does China. If you export, you are earning hard currency. And if your people want to buy Apple telephones, you need that money to buy those telephones from Apple in the United States or China or whatever. So you like your exporters to generate hard currency. So we said, yeah, well, why did we lend money to Nigerian dictators? And they said, what do you mean? We didn't think no, we never did anything like that. Yeah, oh, yes, we did, you know. So we reframed this as an issue with, it takes two to tango. And then people began to think about, what do you mean our government guaranteed selling weapons to Nigerian dictators? You know, and they began to get annoyed about that when they found out that was what was happening. So reframing is terribly important. How we reframe this debate is something that will take me 3 hours, and we should spend a long time thinking about that. But we had to do that. But the thing that inspires me is that when we began, people said, oh, this is very complicated. This is complicated macroeconomics, international finance, it's the role of international creditors and debtors, it's the net present value of the debt, it's all of those complicated. You can't explain that to the public. And I said, no, that's not true. You can. You can explain that. The public are not stupid, but you have to explain it to them, right? So we began writing briefings, one side of a page, in which we tried to explain these issues. And the thing I'll never forget was a Treasury official coming up to me at the end of the campaign in about just before 2000. He said, can you tell me what is going on? He said, in the Treasury, we're getting millions of letters. Gordon Brown has had to employ more people to deal with this. He said, we get letters from women, and they write on pink paper with a bunch of roses in the corner of the page. And they say, dear sir, we understand that in calculating Uganda's debt relief, you chose a cut-off point of 1983, which we find irrational given that debt accumulated before. Who told her about the cut-off point for the debt cancellation of Uganda? I said, we did. It's not rocket science. They're not stupid. We explained it to them. So there's a result of that. $100 billion of debt owed by the poorest countries was written off in 2000. It's still one of the most successful campaigns ever, right? But what it inspired in me was that you can educate, you can help people to understand, you can explain this stuff. It's not rocket science. And when they understand, people act. We didn't have any money for the campaign. We didn't have resources. We had nothing. We had a little office in the middle of London on a roof somewhere with plastic corrugated walls, with the wind coming underneath the plastic and freezing our toes in the winter. We had nothing. But we had this idea, we had this explanation, we had this education, and fortunately, we also had the internet. We were just on the cusp. 5 years earlier, we would not have been able to do it. We had the internet, and we could write, and we could get. So then we built up alliances, north and south, left and right. We didn't mind who joined the campaign as long as they supported the goal, right? We didn't make distinctions. We weren't a political party, we were a movement. And we cancelled at least $100 billion of debt owed by these countries. At the time, it was a huge amount of money. It doesn't feel like a lot of money today, but it was. And what that taught me was that society, once there is understanding and once there is an explanation, can act, can be powerful, can be empowered. But we are now systematically disempowering society by making it sound like this is physics. It's not physics, it's politics, it's power. And when you explain that, people get it, they're not stupid. Okay?